Okay, so welcome today to our Managing Investigations for Effective Outcomes virtual boardroom that is being facilitated by HR Recruit and Nathan Andrews. My name is Jo Thompson. I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Nathan, who will introduce himself shortly. Nathan will be utilising his experience of conducting complex workplace investigations and sharing tips and best practice in this session today. If you've got any questions during the session, then please put them into the chat box facility. But as there is a lot of content to go through, we've allowed time at the end for a Q&A session. I'm now going to hand you over to Nathan, who will introduce himself and start the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Hi, everyone. I'm sure lots of you will have probably seen me before when I've delivered other events, but it's nice to see you, albeit virtually. I'm just going to share my screen. So if you bear with me, you should see a blank screen at the moment. Bear with me. So, Jo, just quickly, can you see my cursor moving over the...
No, I can't see you sharing it yet.
Let me try again.
Yep, see it now.
Can you see this screen here, Jo, that I moved my cursor on?
It's just blue.
Just blue, perfect. Okay, that one there.
Yep, can see
Perfect.
it.
Perfect. I've got new screens, so that I'm still trying to get used to the setup. So you should see my title screen, Jo, can you?
Yep, can see that.
Okay, super. Okay. First of all, guys, for those of you that don't know me or haven't attended one of the events that I've delivered before, my name is Nathan. I'm the Managing Director for O'Connor. We're a specialist employee relations consultancy firm. So myself and my team work with small to medium and large organisations providing specialist ER support and consultancy services. So a lot of our work is focused on dealing with conflict resolution, handling complex workplace investigations, providing advice and guidance on employee relations and employment law matters for clients, and dealing with routine kind of drafting of documentation such as contracts and offer letters and all those good things that you guys are probably really familiar with. So the purpose of today's session is to talk to you about conducting effective investigations. We specialise in this area of work, so I spend a lot of my time in workplace investigations on behalf of our clients. So what we're going to cover today is launching an investigation, considering HR's role in the investigation process. We'll then look at how an investigating officer should approach the investigation process itself. We'll talk about suspension. We'll talk about what happens if the police are involved in a matter that you are investigating. We'll also touch on maintaining confidentiality and protecting identities of witnesses. And we'll talk about holding investigation meetings themselves with employees. And then we'll look at the framework of questions that you should be asking during the investigation meetings that you're holding with relevant witnesses. Then at the end, what I'll do is I will touch on the investigation report and what a good framework looks like for you to use when you're pulling, or for certainly if you're an investigating officer to use when they're pulling together the findings from their investigation. So we'll start with launching an investigation. So how do you go about launching an investigation? One of the things we often talk about when we're advising clients is not every issue will always require an investigation. If you've got a low-level issue that arises, it might be that you're able to deal with things more informally. So if an employee reports an issue, always first consider what informal options are open to you and your team, unless, of course, you have any specific internal policies or procedures which require you to take specific action. So the first thing we do when we speak to clients and they think there's an issue that needs investigating is we just touch on what does your policies and procedures say. Some organisations have very routine policies and procedures, others have more complex. We work with some NHS organisations and sometimes they will have more complex processes and internal procedures. So we take note of those first before we take any immediate steps. So if an investigation does require, if a matter, does require an investigation, what we always advise is that whoever you're going to appoint to act as the investigating officer, they should formulate a detailed investigation plan. Now, this is not something we see happens regularly in practice, but it's a really important part of launching an investigation process. So what we always say is a good plan, a good investigation plan should set out more obviously who the investigating officer will be. It should also set out the terms of reference of the investigation. And this is really important. We do this with our clients. We specifically say to them, what are the terms of reference? What are we investigating specifically? What are the issues or the allegations? And we list those in the investigation plan, because that gives you a solid framework and it keeps you on track and focused. We also set out provisional timelines. So we work out when we're working with our clients, and it would be no different for you guys as internal HR practitioners. Look at provisional timeline of when you're going to start the investigation and when you want to conclude that investigation. And the things that you should look at when you're trying to work out your timeline is how many people do I need to speak to? What evidence do I need to gather? So you're going to be looking at gathering internal policies and procedures that are relevant to the matter under investigation. You want to think about, do I need to gather CCTV footage? Do I need to, how many witness statements do I need to gather? For example, are they all internal or are there some external people that I need to speak to? Those are the things that you should think about when you're setting out your timeline, because it's important that your timeline, whilst it's provisional and it should never be set in stone, it should be a good broad brush approach of you saying, look, this is likely to take me 1, 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the complexity of the matter. So that's really important. Again, I've touched on this briefly, but we always, when we're working with clients, we'll also identify any relevant company policies and procedures which apply. So, for example, it might be as simple as getting a copy of your handbook. We're dealing with a complex matter at the moment on behalf of the client involving IT, and so this particular client has 3 IT policies that are relevant. So we've gathered those along with the handbook, and so we will then look at those policies and procedures and make sure that whatever we do, we're not only complying with them, but if the policies and procedures form part of our evidence bundle, that we have fully reviewed those documents and referenced them. So again, it's really important early on to identify any company policies and procedures you're going to need to look at, because that will then shape the likely timeline of your investigation. There's lots of documentation you're going to need to review. You need to allow sufficient time to review those documents and then be able to summarise the key parts of the documentation that are going to be relevant to your investigation. You also need to identify any issues that need to be dealt with, any complex matters as part of your investigation. Set those out. That's really important. Again, it's really helpful to have that at the front end of your investigation. Again, I've touched on this briefly already, but think about the types of evidence you're going to be collecting. If there's anything like CCTV footage or IT access logs that are going to take time that can be made available to you, back to that in again within your timeline, but also list the type of evidence you want to gather. So when you're going through the investigation process, either as you go through the process itself or at the end, you should be able to go through your investigation plan and tick off all the things that you've done and all the evidence that you have gathered. Again, think about who will need to be interviewed. Are they readily available on site? Do they work at other locations within the business? Is that going to impact their availability or your ability to be able to meet with them? Although often, we're also used to using Zoom and Teams, that's not necessarily going to be an issue today, but things that we should think about as we're starting the investigation process. Think about any specific arrangements for investigation meetings. So recently we've dealt with a matter where someone was hard of hearing, for example, and their preference was that we met with them in person. That would involve us travelling. So we again noted that there were specific arrangements we needed to make for the investigation meeting. And again, it's always, this is in line with setting out your provisional timeline, but you should have in mind a date that the investigation should ideally be completed by. We always start with start and end dates, and we work within those. Now, again, these shouldn't be set in stone, because as you work through the investigation process, you're likely to come up against people not being able to attend meetings as they were arranged, or there might be more information or evidence that you need to gather that will affect those timelines. But if you have them, it gives you that solid framework. Now, I really stress the importance of putting together your investigation plan. It might seem an onerous process, but I've seen and had to remedy many investigation processes that have failed because there wasn't enough planning. And so the planning process is really important. So hold on to that. And I know we often get asked this by clients, because I think there's this feeling when a client has a matter that needs to be investigated, we just need to get it done quickly. And actually what I say is, no, you need to get it done in a timely fashion, but speed shouldn't be the main priority. It should be dealing with it in a timely fashion, but allow yourself sufficient time to be able to go through any and all information and evidence you're gathering as part of that process. So, HR's role in the investigation process. Again, I'm sure most of you will be aware of the limits of our role if we are supporting an investigating officer. So this slide is really about you guys as practitioners supporting an investigating officer who's conducting their investigation. It doesn't apply, so my following comments won't apply if you, as an HR practitioner, are conducting the investigation as the investigating officer. Now, it is clear from case law that HR should not be overly involved in the investigation process if you are supporting. So we should not have any significant influence over the investigating officer and how they conduct the investigation. It's really important, and I always stress this if we're advising clients rather than conducting the investigation for them. So if we are advising, we always say that whoever has been appointed as the investigating officer, it is their investigation and it's for them to gather the facts of the matter and for them to reach their own conclusions based on those facts. But it's not for us as HR practitioners to be asserting any influence over that person. The investigating officer should draft an investigation outcome report once they've concluded the investigation, and that report should set out their findings from the investigation and if any further action is necessary, i.e. if they feel that there is a case to answer and the matter should go to a disciplinary hearing, it would then be for a disciplinary officer or an appeal officer, depending on what stage we're talking about, for them to review the investigation report, and then, if necessary, they can meet with the investigating officer and ask questions, review the report with them, and just sense check the evidence that's been gathered. Again, it's really important that you're not seen to be influencing any part of that process. It's perfectly acceptable for HR to advise on process and procedure, as we know. So if you are giving guidance on specific points of employment law or specific points of the process aligned with your own internal policies and procedures, that's absolutely fine. And it's also acceptable for you to advise on the presentation of the investigation report, or if you feel it to be written in a way that's more clear and concise, as long as you're not asking for any information or any judgments made on the part of the investigating officer to be changed in favour of your own views or opinions. So that is absolutely important. As we said, it's not acceptable for HR to have any significant influence whatsoever in the investigation, because that actually would be seen as you influencing the investigating officer and potentially shaping their view on the evidence that they've gathered. You know, they should be forming opinions and viewpoints based on the evidence they've gathered, and it shouldn't be something where we're shaping or trying to change their opinion on a particular point. So, approaching the investigation process. Now, what we say is, and this is often a challenge for our clients, especially if they're a small organisation and they lack a large enough management team who has significant experience or sufficient experience of conducting investigations. But what we would always say, and certainly what we say to clients when they are handling investigations themselves, is that a good investigating officer will be thorough and considered in their approach. They won't fly by the seat of the pants when they're conducting their investigation, so they will be prepared to give it the time that's necessary to do the investigation justice. So what we don't want is somebody to do the bare minimum to get the job done as quickly as possible, and certainly we don't want someone taking that approach because they perceive that the person's already guilty and therefore it's, you know, it's a slam dunk, if you will. So you want somebody who is, you know, going to be capable of gathering information, capable of analysing that information, and capable of presenting that information back to you and doing that in a timely manner. But it certainly shouldn't be, you know, the approach here shouldn't be about let's get this done quickly. It should be let's get this done in a timely manner that does the investigation process justice. The other thing you want to do is avoid somebody going down rabbit holes. So we can often see that as the investigation process becomes long and protracted, because actually often where there's not been an investigation plan formulated with clear terms of reference, we see people end up going much wider or broader in their approach to the investigation than is necessary. So if you've got a good investigation plan, you've got a good clear set of terms of reference, this shouldn't be an issue. But it's important when you're appointing an investigating officer to make it clear to them what they're investigating, and that is, that should be their focus. Now, as HR professionals, it is our job to meet with the investigating officer and make it clear to them the extent with which we require them to investigate any issues and to interview staff members. So really, your approach to instructing an investigating officer is to conduct a thorough investigation that captures all the relevant evidence and doesn't overlook evidence. So again, it's making it clear to them, we're not asking for speed. We just want this to be done in a timely fashion that captures all the relevant information we need to be able to make a judgment around what happens next. Now, we always say, as is always the case in HR, we should always act reasonably. So if you're conducting an investigation, that process in itself should be reasonable. So that includes a reasonable time frame, following any internal procedures where necessary, obviously establishing the facts of the matter, avoiding confirmation bias, seeping into the investigation process, and obviously being mindful of confidentiality wherever possible. This is a point that we often come across if we're dealing with matters that are potentially gross misconduct. So suspension often comes up as an issue, and that's something we talk to our clients about. So what we always advise is only ever suspend if absolutely necessary, and you should have an absolutely solid reason for doing so. So things like health and safety concerns, a risk to the integrity of the investigation process itself. So if you think that there's a risk to evidence being tampered with, you would look to suspend in those circumstances. If you believe there are further acts of misconduct, for example, or that working relationships have been damaged so significantly that there are potential other issues for the business, you would again look to suspend. What we do say is always apply caution. I mean, when I first started out in HR nearly 20 years ago, there was always a viewpoint that if you were going to consider dismissing someone, you would automatically suspend. And that viewpoint has changed. And I think that changed probably over a decade ago, which is actually, suspension should only apply if it is necessary. And it's not about whether we're, considering dismissing somebody. What we do say is there are 5 key ways that suspension can lead to constructive dismissal claims that you should be aware of. So we would always say if a suspension is inappropriate or draconian, and what we mean by that is that if there's no evidence to support that that suspension was necessary, then we shouldn't be doing it. If suspension goes on for a period which is longer than necessary, sometimes we see this when we're advising clients where a period of suspension has gone on for longer than it should have done. And I recently dealt with a case actually where a client suspended an employee, and the reason for suspension was there was concerns around evidence being tampered with. And actually, once the client had gathered all the relevant evidence and there was no risk of that being lost, we then advised the client to bring that person back into work, because the process up until that point had taken nearly 3 weeks. And we said, actually, it's our advice to bring that person back into work now, because if it goes on any longer, it starts to feel punitive. There are some roles that make suspension more complex. We often use the airline pilot as an example. So if you've got an employee who has to commit a certain amount of hours to key skills or certain certifications as part of their job role, suspension could be inappropriate in those circumstances. Again, these are very specific sets of circumstances, but things that you should think about. The other thing we stress to clients, if you are going to suspend, if you're going to communicate that to anybody, i.e. that an employee has been suspended, it must be done in a in a neutral way, so that you're not breaking confidentiality or oversharing information that doesn't need to be shared. So, for example, we'll often advise clients that, if someone's on suspension, you would just say that they're on leave and say nothing more. So if you are communicating suspension, less is more. Don't overshare and just be mindful of confidentiality. And finally, the final point is suspending without pay. We often get asked this. We have some clients who have actually got clauses in their contracts that allow them to suspend without pay. We always advise that you wouldn't do that. Even if there is a clause in the contract that entitles you to do so, we just feel that actually you're leaving yourself exposed to potential claims, because if we're making the decision that the employee needs to not be in the business, we don't feel it's fair that person should suffer financially because of our decision to ask them not to attend work. So there are 5 points to consider with suspension. But as always, if you are going to suspend an employee, make sure that you've got solid grounds to do so and capture that in your records. If you do make a decision to suspend an employee, make sure you capture that detail in your notes. So if anybody asks you why, you can refer back to that information. I say these were broadly the discussion points. This was the rationale for our decision making, and you've got that then in your bundle. So police involvement, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail. We do see this a lot where we've got a couple of cases actually at the moment where employees are under investigation and the police are involved. Now, sometimes we do weigh up whether it's appropriate for us to investigate if the police are conducting their own investigation. And almost in all cases, we will advise that we should proceed with our own investigation for one of two reasons. We have a very different burden of proof in employment law than the police do in criminal law. So we're not looking to prove anything beyond all reasonable doubt. We're looking to prove something on the balance of probabilities. And what I mean by that is it reasonable for us to believe that an allegation has taken place, as an example? Often with the police investigation, it can take months, if not years, and that is often not helpful to an organisation that needs to address issues with an employee in a timely manner. So our approach is always that there's no specific rules or legislation that say we can't conduct our own investigation. And so we will always proceed in doing that, but we will never, we won't overlook the fact that the police are involved, and so we will apply caution to how we deal with that investigation. So if you are facing a situation where the police are involved and you're uncertain about, whether you should proceed, always take advice. But in almost all cases that we deal with, we do conduct our investigation whilst the police are involved, because it's not reasonable for an employer to put matters on hold for months, if not years, depending on what's being dealt with. Right, okay. So maintaining confidentiality and protecting the identity of witnesses. This often comes up a lot for us in terms of the conversation around protecting confidentiality, but more importantly, can we protect the identity of witnesses? So we always say confidentiality should be at the heart of your investigation process, especially if you want to avoid grievances or any constructive dismissal claims. So that is important. So always be considered with what you're sharing, including it during investigation meetings with witnesses. So be very mindful of what you say and how you say it. The investigation process should be as confidential as is possible for you, and then the information should not be readily shared unless it's absolutely appropriate. So again, it's using judgment here, and it's relying on the judgment of the investigating officer. Every person spoken as part of the investigation process should be told that the nature of the investigation and any subsequent conversations you have are strictly confidential, and that if that is breached, it does render the person liable to potential disciplinary action themselves. I think it's really helpful at the start to make that clear. We often deal with issues around confidentiality, and it's very difficult to manage if an employee says, well, actually, I wasn't aware, but A, I shouldn't talk about it, or B, if I did, I could face disciplinary action myself. So make it really clear and give them a solid framework to follow. Now, whilst we always say with witness confidentiality that you should treat witness statements as confidential documents, what we never advise our clients to do is to give an absolute guarantee of confidentiality to the witness themselves. So we'll often see cases where witnesses say, well, I'm happy to give you a statement, but can you protect my identity? I don't want the person to know that you've spoken to me. And what we say to our clients is, no, you don't give a guarantee of confidentiality or anonymity, because the reality is an employee, the person who's subject to the allegations being made, they are entitled to be able to see the evidence that you gather to be able to prepare their case. And if you're protecting the identity of witnesses, it makes it very hard for them to be able to do that. There's only limited circumstances where I would consider protecting the identity of witnesses, and that would be if they were genuine and significant concerns about reprisals. But again, I would look to investigate any witnesses' concerns in that regard before I made the decision to protect their identity. To give you an example for context, we've recently dealt with a really serious matter involving an employee. Police were involved in that matter, and we did make a decision in this particular case to redact the witness statements to protect the identities of two specific witnesses. So what we did was summarise the witness statements and put the summary to the individual, but we didn't give them the identities of those persons and who had given us that information, and we were able to justify why. Now that's not the norm for us. We say, look, if we don't accept that there's any risk of reprisals or risk to someone's safety, we would always say avoid redacting witness statements or protecting the identity of them, because it does make it difficult for the individual to prepare their case and to be able to test the evidence or present a different viewpoint, if that makes sense. So that's something to consider. So yes, in certain circumstances you can make witness statements anonymous, but it's not something we would advise you do as a matter of routine, and it should only be done when it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so the investigation meetings themselves. Again, it's really important that these meetings are planned. So we say, or we advise our clients when they're handling the an investigation process themselves, that they should plan questions for all the people they're going to be speaking to in advance. So they go in with a pre-prepared list of questions. That doesn't mean that as you work through the meeting, you don't ask any other questions to test information that's come up through the natural process of following your own pre-prepared line of questioning. But it's really important that you go in with that, doing the prep work. And, you'll be surprised at the amount of times we have advised clients when, certainly after they've done an investigation and things have gone wrong, and they've then asked us to go in and do our own investigation because they felt the first investigation they did was flawed. We often discovered that actually the person conducting the investigation didn't make time to prepare before they went in. They went in with, this is the allegation. They asked limited amounts of questions and didn't actually give them the information they needed. So it's a really important point. Most of you will already know this stuff if you work in HR, but it's an important point to make clear you're appointing a line manager who has limited experience of conducting these types of processes, that they are, aware you should be going in prepared. You should be looking at any allegations or your terms of reference again, and then formulating questions accordingly. Again, they should make logistical arrangements before they hold those meetings, and making sure if they're meeting with people in person, you've got an adequate meeting room. That meeting room offers confidentiality, so it's private. There's no risk of discussions being overheard. They should write to the attendees, inviting them to the investigation meeting. We do that as a matter of course when we're handling the investigation process on behalf of our client. We send a standard letter inviting them to the investigation meeting. As we know, there isn't a right to be accompanied at investigation meetings. If certain witnesses ask that they are supported, we often will say yes, because we don't, from our perspective, there's no issue in someone being supported if they feel anxious about attending an investigation meeting. At the start of the investigation meeting itself, again, we always recommend, if it's a line manager conducting the investigation meeting, to have an agenda and to work through that agenda. So we'll always say, cover off who's present and why, talk about the purpose of the meeting, explain the investigating officer's role, which is a fact-finding role and it's not a decision-making role, cover off confidentiality and the possible consequences of breaching that confidentiality, discuss who will see the notes or the statement from the meeting. So, for example, it's often important to inform the person that the employee who's subject to the allegations, they are likely to see that witness statement. In fact, in almost all cases, they will see that, because you should be making that evidence available to them in the bundle if the matter goes to a disciplinary hearing. It's important to make the people taking part in your investigation meetings aware of that. So during the investigation meeting itself, we always advise that you should adopt a focused approach, because these meetings shouldn't be onerous. So you want to be focused in terms of getting the facts. You want to probe, but not in an aggressive way. So you're not there to adopt an adversarial manner with the employee that you're speaking to, because that's likely to make them feel threatened or intimidated, which would then influence the quality of the information they share with you. If the person you're interviewing refuses to answer questions, make a note of that. We often see that, and we'll ask why they refuse to answer that question. Sometimes they refuse to answer that secondary question. So make a note of any questions that they refuse to answer. Look for opportunities to find any evidence which can substantiate what is being said. So that again is being, be curious when you're conducting investigations. I always say there's nothing wrong with an investigating officer being really nosy and asking lots of great questions that helps lead them to evidence that can substantiate what's being said. So don't take anything at face value. At the end of the meeting, ask any attendees if they have anything to add, or if they feel that there's anything important for them to mention as part of the investigation. Ask them if there are any other people that they believe you should interview as part of the investigation process. Explain you may need to arrange a follow-up meeting with them. We often do that. Sometimes at the end of the investigation process, we will look back at the notes once they're prepared. We think actually we need to ask several follow-up questions. Just make it clear to them that may happen, and if it does, it's that there's nothing to worry about. And also explain that they will receive a copy of the notes from the meeting, and ask them to review those notes and to either sign them and send you back a copy, or to confirm by return email they've received the notes, they have reviewed them, and that they are happy that the notes serve as a fair reflection of what you discussed with them during that meeting. That's really important. Make sure you have that on record in your bundle. So questions, again, I'm not going to go into any great detail because you guys will be really skilled at this already. But we always say, have a great mix of open questions, closed questions when you want answers to specific questions, but you don't want lots of information that isn't relevant. So closed questions can be great for that. Always ask probing questions. Remember, it's really important to test the evidence. So don't just take at face value what someone is saying to you. Test the evidence, but do that in a way that's not or is not necessarily perceived as you being aggressive. Feeling questions can be really helpful as well, and not always necessary, but asking some good feeling questions, things like, why did you feel that you had to step in, for example? That would be a good example of a feeling question. They can be really great for you to gather more information. Also, what else questions we use a lot during investigations. So it might be, is there anything else you think I need to know? Again, it just gives you the opportunity to gather as much information as you can. Now, one really important point to remember at the end of the investigation meeting is just to summarise what you've been told and what you've heard. So if there is anything that you've misunderstood, it gives the employee the opportunity to correct you and to make sure that the information you have is accurate as you finish the meeting. So that's really important. And then finally, the investigation report. This is really important. We see lots of organisations who have had an internal line manager conduct an investigation, and the outcome of that investigation is just recorded in a letter. Some of those letters are on 1 or 2 pages. What we say is that can never allow you to set out the findings from an investigation in a clear and factual way. It's too short. You're not able to summarise the information you've gathered. The whole purpose of a detailed investigation report is for you to not only set out your findings, but also explain why you've made certain decisions. So if you prefer a certain piece of evidence, for example, you want to explain why, and you can't do that in a 1 or 2 page letter. So you should adopt the introduction of an investigation outcome report as a matter of standard practice. So what I want to cover off with you is, if an investigating officer has been asked to make recommendations as part of the investigation, then they should do so on the following basis only. So that is whether there's formal action that needs to be taken, i.e. the matter should be referred to a disciplinary hearing, or whether there's informal action required. So they could recommend that mediation or further training is necessary, or there's no further action required, i.e. they've done the investigation and they don't believe that there's a case to answer. It's really important that the investigating officer does not make comments around what sanctions they believe should be issued. That is a matter for the disciplinary officer, not for the investigating officer. So they should make no comment on that. And if you see an investigating officer putting that kind of dialogue in their report, you need to challenge that and say, actually, no, you're overstepping the boundaries of your role as the investigator. So the investigation report should be clear and concise, should also be objective when setting out the facts and findings from the investigation. That is really important. Some top tips from ACAS include avoiding the use of nicknames or jargon, simply and appropriate language, sticking to the facts. We always, stress to clients, stick to the facts. That's really important. Include all the evidence collected that you've collected. So when we draft our investigation outcome reports, all the evidence we've collected, that is summarised at the front of the report. It's also included in the appendices. We also code all the evidence we gather. We have a simple coding structure, so it would start with D1, document 1, right the way through to how many documents we gather. We've just dealt with one case where we've had 139 documents. So we will reference those documents, and then when we're typing out our findings, we will pull direct extracts from the evidence if we're explaining why we find in a particular way. So that's really important. So a good investigation report in its basic form should be structured with a good introduction at the start, an outline of the investigation process. That's really important. Set out an outline of the investigation process that has been followed. So when somebody picks up that report, they can see what you did, and that's really helpful. It should also have a section that sets out the findings, and it should have a section for the conclusion recommendations. So in its most basic format, ours is a bit more complex than that, but in its most basic format, you should have those 5 sections as a minimum. And the one thing we always say to the person writing that report is think about writing your report in a way that tells a story. So if you, as a disciplinary officer or an appeal officer, were to pick up that report, it tells you the story of the investigation process, who you've spoken to, what evidence you've gathered, who you've not been able to speak to, what evidence you've not been able to gather for whatever reason. Document it clearly in that investigation report so that whoever picks up that report gets the full story from having one read of the report overall. Okay, that is the end of our presentation. So we can go to questions. I'm going to stop sharing as well, Jo. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. There's nothing in the chat box yet. So if anyone's got any questions and you want to either unmute yourself or put something in the chat box, then feel free.
Yes. Might be it's a bit of a dry topic, investigations.
We're still viewing your screen, Nathan.
Oh, are you?
Mm.
Ah.
Yeah, there will be, it is being recorded. So I'll be sending out an email after the event and there'll be details of how to access a copy. Can you see that one, Nathan?
Oh, I've got some chats coming up.
How
detrimental is the process if we don't have witnesses sign their statements? Well, it can leave you open to challenge by the individual who's the subject of any complaint or allegation. So, for example, they may say, well, has this person seen the notes or the records that you're sending to me? Also, it does leave the opportunity for the person you've spoken to say, actually, no, I wasn't happy with the notes. They don't serve as a fair reflection of what I've explained to you, or you've misunderstood. So for me, I'm like a dog with a bone. I will always chase people and say, I've sent you this record. I need you to review it and to confirm that you're happy that it serves as a fair reflection of our discussion points. Now, something we do as a matter of routine now is we record all of our meetings and we advise our clients to do so. And the reason we do that, and this is always a thorny subject, because people will often say, when I say people, I'm talking about client organisations, will often say, is it a good idea to record a meeting when you've got line managers who are likely to say something they shouldn't say? And what we always say is, hopefully your line managers will have sufficient training and common sense. Now, I know common sense is not always that common, but hopefully you'll have sufficient skill and capability within your management team that they will be considered in what they say. However, what we see an awful lot is where people are still taking handwritten notes and the employee takes a covert recording. And whilst that is unacceptable, there is evidence to support that tribunals will allow covert recordings into evidence if it's relevant. And so it's often helpful if you've got your own recording and you can therefore let the employee record if they wish. And then what we do is we type up a proper transcript. And so that transcript then actually doesn't often get argued when we used to take handwritten notes. Often what would happen is, certainly with the employee who's the subject of a complaint or allegations, they will typically say, no, that's not what I said, or you haven't captured the way I said it. And that's what we say is, look, obviously we can't capture emotion on paper, but if we record the meeting, what we can do is capture an absolute accurate record of that meeting. We're not reliant on someone being sat in the meeting, scribbling madly for an hour, trying to capture what I'm saying, what the respondent is saying. So we typically record our meetings, but we always make sure that the person signs to say, yes, we're happy with the record that you've provided from our meeting. It just avoids you having any challenge over the validity of the records that you're submitting as evidence.
Okay. Leslie's asked, do we have to interview? Can we get statements?
What statements where the individual themselves writes the statement?
It doesn't specify.
Well, if it's where you're getting an employee to provide their own written statement, yes, you can do. But what I would always say, and we get this sometimes where somebody will give us a written statement by email, for example, I will go and test that. So I will still want to meet with them. So actually, it makes more sense from a time perspective. You sit with that employee, you go in, you ask them the question that you want to ask, rather than just relying on someone putting something down on paper. It's all about testing the evidence. You can't do that if you just accept at face value someone's written submissions.
Holly's asked, do you have to invite someone to an investigation meeting?
You don't have to. There's, an investigation meeting is a fact-finding meeting. You're perfectly entitled to meet with your employees. So you can just bring people in. If they're sat at the desk, you pop up and say, can we have a chat? We like to invite people to investigation meetings. We think actually it's helpful that they come into that meeting knowing beforehand what it's about. Often when if I think back to my corporate days when I was in-house HR manager, if we were approach somebody and pull them from their desk into a meeting, they would be a little bit overwhelmed and surprised. Why am I here? Have I done anything wrong? And then we know you haven't. We want to speak about X, Y, or Z. And actually, it just made the meeting more clunky. And I often found we didn't get the best out of the individual. But if they know why you're meeting with them and they know broadly, you don't give them lots of detail. But if you give them broadly what you're talking about, I often find that the person comes more prepared, if that helps. But you don't have to. So it's entirely preference. My preference is that we invite someone to that meeting.
I've been sent a question, Nathan,
yes,
to ask how not to panic when you have really difficult testing characters.
That takes such a question that takes lots of practice. I now, because I spend my whole life, it feels like, doing investigation meetings, that is like water off a duck's back. To me, the best way to deal with really difficult characters is to go in and be prepared. And I can remember when I was an in-house HR manager, and we would deal, and I can think of one case now because there's one person that stands up because they were so unpleasant to deal with. And they were known throughout the whole business as being a really difficult, awkward person. And my way of dealing with that and to overcome it's the anxiety around, knowing that you're going to have a really difficult time, was to go in and be really prepared. So I had my list of questions, and I still do that to this day. I go in with a full list of questions, and if someone is difficult or they're not answering the question, I am just dogmatic. These are my questions. This is the information I want. The other thing I don't do is I don't allow myself to get into an argument or a debate with somebody. So, for example, they're not prepared to give me an answer to the question, I'll always ask them twice. So if I'll ask them once, and if they don't give me the information, I'll say, look, no, this is the information I need. So I'm going to repeat my question. And if they don't provide the information again, it's noted down. They've not provided us with the information we've asked, and we move on. Because nothing comes from us getting into a debate or an argument about someone not giving us the information, as long as you note down, I've asked them the question twice, and I always make sure, do they understand the question? So the person looks at me as if I'm being a bit condescending. I'm not, but I want to make sure, do you understand what I'm asking you? And then that's noted down as well. And then we move on and ask my other questions. And recently I've got through half a meeting, not half a meeting, through a whole meeting where the individual had only answered half the questions because they were being deliberately challenging. And so it was clearly noted. I was very clinical or forensic, if you will, with how I approached that, which was, I've asked you the question, I've asked you twice, and I've checked that you've understood the question. You're therefore choosing not to answer, and it's all noted down. And then when I sent them notes, that was all noted down because we recorded, so they couldn't again even come back and say, well, no, that's not what you said. So actually it was in the recording, you've got the transcript. So there, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's good. Rachel's asked, do you recommend that HR don't do the investigation process?
That really depends on the size of your HR team, whether you're standalone. I would often say if you're standalone or a very small HR team, you need to make a judgment about how involved you want to get in the operational day-to-day aspect of managing employee relations. In an ideal world, it will always be the line manager. And line managers look at me horrified when I say this normally in training sessions, but I always say, look, if you're a line manager, they are your people. You're responsible for your people, and it's your job to manage. We will be here to support and to advise, but we don't necessarily get involved in the day-to-day. The challenge of you, I suppose, being involved in the day-to-day nuts and bolts of managing ER and investigations is that it can, particularly if you've got a challenging character, it can allow that person to try and drag HR into the mix of, I'm not being treated fairly, HR said this, HR did that, investigation, was biased against me. So it really does depend on the size of your organisation. Now, I've got one client and they've got a team of 20 in their HR team, and they will deal with lower level investigations, but outsource the rest to us because they say, actually, we don't want our team to be dragged into that process if we later find ourselves having to defend a tribunal claim. So it is preference. There is nothing wrong with you handling investigations and HR practitioners being the investigation officer. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I would say is if you are doing that, make sure you do a really good job of conducting investigation and producing a really good report at the end. And that's the onus bit. And the one thing I will say to anybody is a good investigation report, if you're dealing even with something that doesn't feel particularly complicated, it will take you time. So if I was talking to you, I mentioned earlier about a case we recently handled where we had 129 documents, for example. That investigation report, because it was a fairly complex matter, there was a lot of information. That took me three and a half days of solidly working that report for the client, pulling it all together. So you can often find that it will take you a couple of days of pulling that report together. And it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, this is taking too long. It shouldn't take me that long. Actually, if you're going to do the investigation process justice, it takes time to look at all the information and to pull it together. And because as you're doing that, what you're doing is you're thinking about, what does the evidence tell me? What do I think about that? Have I tested it? Am I happy with it? Can I set out, a justification for why I'm finding it a particular way? All of that takes time. And if anyone challenges you on, it should only take you a couple of hours to produce a report, I would absolutely say, if you haven't done hundreds now of investigations, they do take time, even the more, straightforward ones. So if you spend a couple of days in the report, you're doing it justice. So I thought I'd just throw that out there.
Helen has asked, do you have a sample investigation report that you could share?
I do. Would you like me to? Shall I send it to Joe?
So, yeah, send it to me and then I can send it. Let me just, I'll just make a note now. Another Helen has asked, can you use an anonymised witness statement at a tribunal hearing?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never sent an anonymised witness statement. I'll double check. I can't see why you wouldn't. It's not something I've ever done or ever been asked, actually. That's a really good question. Does anyone else know on the call? Somebody else might have if you know better than me, let me know. My view is I can't see why you wouldn't, because if you've got a justifiable reason for redacting a witness statement, you would put it in the bundle as redacted. You wouldn't want even at the tribunal stage, you wouldn't want the employee to know potentially who'd spoken to. But again, just to go back to that piece about protecting the identity of witnesses, if you think about the concept of natural justice in the practice of employment law, an employee does have the right to be able to state their case and defend their position. So again, if we are anonymising witness statements, it makes it really hard for that person to be able to do that, because what they're likely to say is, well, actually, how can I defend my case if I don't even know who's made complaints or given witness statements? So, for example, they may say, well, actually, that person said they witnessed me do X, Y, Z on a certain date, but actually they weren't in the business on that date. So that's just an example. But so I can't see why you wouldn't. I will sense check with my colleague Deborah, who's an employment solicitor. But because we don't. Deborah will deal with tribunal claims. I don't defend in the tribunal. But that's a really good question. So I'll find out and I'll let Joe know and come back to you.
Sandy's asked, if a witness really doesn't want to give evidence, even though they know something or they witness something, is there anything the company can do?
Well, I mean, what I would do in those circumstances, you can't physically force someone to give us information. So if they're saying, look, I'm not prepared to give information, I would want to have a conversation with them and ask them why. Some people go down, when I say some people, clients will go down the route of actually, I'm asking you to give me information. I think it's a lawful instruction. It's a reasonable management request. You're not complying, and therefore I'm going to discipline you. I always say that's, from my viewpoint, is quite draconian, and actually it's not going to get you a good outcome, because that employee could say, actually, I feel uncomfortable about providing that information. Putting me in this position has caused me to feel stress or anxiety. It's impacting my mental health. All those things. You've got to think about the welfare of the people you are speaking to. So my view is, no, I can't force someone to give me information. I'm not going to stand over them with a stick and beat them about the head until they, give me the information I need. But what I would do is sit with that person saying, look, I'm asking this information because it's important to the case that we're investigating. Can you talk about why you don't want to give them that information? That might give you the opportunity to talk about, is that, do we need to, give consideration to anonymising their witness statement, again, only in exceptional circumstances. And just making clear to that person, this is a confidential process. If you've got any concerns, we're here to support you, etc. That can often be enough to get them to give you the information that you're looking for. But again, if some point blank refuses, my view is we can't force somebody.
So Ashley's asked, do you have a couple of key snappy sentences or points to get buy-in from a manager to support with an investigation? She says they get a lot of pushback where managers don't want to lead on it and see it as not part of their role. So even if they agree, they do not give it the time necessary. So HR are chasing them all the time.
I'm not recommending you say this to your line managers, but what I used to say when I was back in corporate life was and this was always the norm, that I don't want to do the investigation, you law and HR can do it, blah 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 blah. And I would always say, look, you're paid a salary to be a line manager. So if you want me to take away some of your line management responsibilities, let me talk to you about the percentage of your salary that I'm going to keep for me to do some of your job. That was one bog standard response. And actually people just go, oh, okay. But I wouldn't say that, obviously. I wouldn't advise you to say that. I would say it to managers in the organisation I was at the time, because it was a valid point. Ultimately, they are the line manager and they're responsible for their employees. And if you're paying them a management salary and they don't want to do a certain percentage of their duties and responsibilities, then let's talk about how we can reduce your salary accordingly. And that normally gets a quick response. Alternatively, what I would say is that you would want to sit down with the line manager and say, look, if we don't get this right, depending on what you're dealing with, this could have significant repercussions. If we don't, do the investigation itself justice, this could see us land in the tribunal defending a tribunal claim. No, there were no winners in those circumstances. Whilst I've never defended, a tribunal claim. I get my role within my business goes right up until the ET3, and so we do all that prep work, and right up until that. But there are no winners in that process. For the person bringing the claim, for the people defending the claim, it causes a lot of stress and anxiety. And we've just dealt with one case I'm about to pass over to our solicitor that works with us. And the claimant is their mental health has suffered significantly from this particular case. We feel we can defend the case, but we don't overlook the fact that this person has made themselves really poorly because they've not wanted to let go of their viewpoint, no matter how much we've kind of presented the evidence and said, look, this is the evidence. We have done a fair investigation process. It's made them really ill. So what we would say to line managers is, you don't want to find yourself being called as a witness in the tribunal, and so it's in your interest, if you're being asked to conduct an investigation, to do that and to do it well and to do it justice. And again, ultimately, if that line manager refuses, then you've got a conduct issue to deal with, because essentially it's a reasonable request that you're asking them to undertake a workplace activity that is within, certainly should be within their skill set as a manager. And certainly if you've got HR in place who are there to support. So if they say, well, actually, I've got some of the skills, not all of them, well, HR can support things like note taking, making sure you're giving advice and guidance. So it should be, within their skill set to be able to complete what you're asking them to do. And if they don't, and they're, unreasonably refusing to deal with that, then I would deal with that as a conduct issue.
So Leslie's asked, if someone is left on full pay suspension for a lengthy period, even though a police investigation had months ago already outruled any criminality, does the individual just continue to sit tight at home, or do they have any way of insisting they're allowed back to work?
Well, there's a number of questions I'd want to ask in that regard. So if the police investigation concludes that there was no criminal act, fine. That doesn't mean that you can't take disciplinary action with an employee, because again, we operate on a very different burden of proof. Within criminal law, it's proven something beyond a reasonable doubt. Within employment law, it's on balance of probability. So what's reasonable for us to believe in all of the circumstances. But my question would be, is if a police investigation has concluded, why is that person still on suspension? And is that because you've waited to start your own investigation after the police have concluded theirs? And if that is the case, you then need to make a judgment in those circumstances of, is it still appropriate that person is suspended, given the length of time that has gone on? And if it is, we need to be really clear about the timelines of your workplace investigation, so you can manage the expectations of that employee. Because my only concern in these circumstances, and I see this a lot in public sector, is that I always think, God, we're going to end up with a constructive dismissal claim here because we suspended this person. They've been out of the business for months, and that now feels really punitive, and that actually feels like that person could say, actually, there's a loss of trust here because you've treated me really badly. Because what I always say is, if the police are investigating, the reality is it could take months, and therefore it's not really advisable that we put on hold our own investigation, because the employee does have a right to have matters concluded from an employment perspective in a timely manner. So that is something to consider. And I appreciate, when I've worked in health and social care and the NHS in my corporate HR career, and when safeguarding issues were raised, the police would come in and they would say to you, no, you're not to do any investigation. And I would often say, well, actually, sorry, I'm going to, because I've got a workplace matter that I've got to deal with. We will be very mindful of your investigation. And actually, if we uncover any information we think is pertinent to your investigation, we would look to share that, especially if we're talking about a criminal act. Again, you do have to be mindful about data protection and not breaching GDPR and so on. But that would be my approach. So, and there was a couple of questions in there. I appreciate whoever's asked that question, but I hope that helps.
Ned, no, you're right. Just for one last question.
Yeah,
I'm just conscious of time.
No, that's fine.
So Kelly's asked, if someone is in probation with a potential gross misconduct case, would you continue to disciplinary action as best practice or use probation?
Well, again, it depends on the act of misconduct. But if you're going to go absolute belt and braces, best practice, there's nothing wrong with going through a disciplinary process, including some kind of investigation. Typically, we don't do that in organizations because we adopt this kind of, we're going to be commercial. I love when people say, I want to be commercial. I want a commercial, action plan. And actually, I think, look, the reality is you've got to weigh up the pros and cons of, if you go down a disciplinary procedure and you start an investigation with somebody who's new into the business, that does take time, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong thing to do. And it does mean your belt and braces. So, for example, where, as we all know, in the first 2 years of employment, people can't bring a claim for unfair dismissal. What they can bring is a claim for things like discrimination, for example, any exceptional circumstances that whistleblowing, those sorts of things. So what we often see in practice is that employees within the first 2 years try and substitute their own reason for dismissal so that they can potentially bring a claim for things such as discrimination or whistleblowing or health and safety and so on. So if you conduct your own disciplinary procedure early on, even during the probation period, it does mean that you are being belt and braces watertight with, there was a genuine issue, it was misconduct, we did an investigation, and here's the evidence. What I always say to clients when we have this conversation about should I do a conduct a disciplinary procedure, is let's just work the risks. So we will always talk about length of service, less than 2 years. Are there any exceptional circumstances? And what we mean by that is, has the person raised any health and safety concerns? Are there any grievances? Is there any potential claims for whistleblowing? And we'll go into some detail of that. And the client will typically say no. And then we'll say, no, in our view, the risk is low. They can't bring a claim for unfair dismissal. Therefore, take a commercial view on it. Do you want to go through the process of having to investigate, typing up all the notes, gathering the evidence, conducting a hearing, and so on? So it's got to be a decision about what's reasonable in the circumstances and what's reasonable for the business in terms of cost, because it will be cost ultimately. Even if you're dealing with it internally, you've got line management costs for overseeing that process. I hope that answers the question.
That's it for questions, Nathan. So is there anything else you want to say to finish up?
No, other than that, I hope it was interesting. I know it's a bit of a dry topic, investigations. I love it. I'm a really nosy person. So I think I'm always in my happy place to ask loads of questions and be really curious about stuff. But if any of you've got any, anything pops up, we've got any issues, feel free to drop me an email, get in touch with Joe, she can get in touch with me. I hope it was helpful. And as always, it's lovely to spend time with you guys.
Thanks, Nathan. So we will send out some correspondence this afternoon to the people who have signed up for the event, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn. So if you'd like a copy of the slides and or the recording, then please put a comment against the LinkedIn post. Our next event is actually this Monday at 9:30, and it's called Tools and Techniques to Manage Conflict in the Workplace, and is being facilitated by Vista Employer Services. A link to sign up to that session will be in the email. We will also send out a quick survey to everyone this afternoon that has registered. So if you've got a couple of minutes to spare, then your feedback about the event would be much appreciated. If anyone is recruiting, we've also got accountancy recruit, FD recruit and executive recruit within the group. But finally, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to Nathan for your time and effort in putting the event together, and also to everyone for attending. I'm sure you'll agree it's been a great session. So thanks very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And feel free, anyone, to follow us on LinkedIn or connect with me. I love connections. So yeah, feel free.